Here we go. Uh,
Welcome, Arnie. Thanks for talking to us.
yeah, thank you guys. So today we're going to be talking about porcini, obviously, king boletes, one of my favorite edible mushrooms, and one that I get probably the most requests to teach people how to identify. Um, it's for some reason boletes in general, and especially porcini, tend to mystify people in the mushroom community, especially in the United States. I know that I personally was always sort of fearful of them, um, especially in the first few years that I was hunting mushrooms, and I didn't. There wasn't a lot of people who collected them or ate them um, where I lived, and so I was very hesitant about doing it, and I never really heard any outstanding things about them, so I never really thought about it. I knew that I you could find them in the store. I've seen little packages of them dried up, but I never really um, thought about what they were used for and why they were being sold in the supermarket when just about no other mushrooms are. So today we're going to talk a little bit about uh, obviously identifying porcini, especially in Wisconsin, but just in general. And we're going to talk about preparation in terms of good recipes to try. Why I think at least they're not nearly as prevalent in the United States in cuisine. Um, so and we will also be talking about preservation and what I like to do to kind of gauge when I'm keeping a king bolete, what time of the year I search for them and for what reasons, and how I preserve them for long-term storage. So, without further ado, get into it. Um, so boletes, obviously, just real quick, you need to know what a bolete is if you're going to identify boletes. Um, a bolete, most of you will know, has a stem, a stipe, a cap, and pores underneath instead of gills. It's just the way that it has evolved to maximize the surface area for its spore production. So it has lots of little it has a spongy porous surface with lots of little pores full of spores. So learning what a bolete is obviously necessary if you're going to be hunting porcini. Um, so, and it's basically an overall shape of mushroom. There's the family Boletaceae, but in general, it's the stem, the cap, and the spongy pore surface underneath. So, which boletes are poisonous? There have been almost no deaths associated with eating boletes of any kind in the world. There was one in 1994, a couple who died. Um, uh, there was one in 2005 and 2009. The mushrooms that do cause the bolete mushrooms that do cause poisoning tend to have a red pore surface. So a good rule, especially for beginners, is to avoid all boletes with a red pore surface. There is, as far as I know, no poisonous boletes, definitely no seriously poisonous boletes in Wisconsin. There are certainly some that I would advise against harvesting without uh, trying a small amount first. In fact, that would be most of them, except for the choice edibles. So the Lexinum, the Scaber stock boletes that are very popular in Eastern Europe, the red cap Scaber stock boletes.
Arnie, your sound might have gone out.
Species. Oh, do I have you back?
Yes,
Okay.
I think anyway.
Aspen or birch boletes. Make sure that you are trying to identify those two species With the edulis clade boletes, which we'll be talking about today, the Porcini boletes, it's not as important to identify them two species because they share a lot of characteristics and they're all choice edibles. But if you're going to be harvesting like the Scaberstock boletes, the slippery jack boletes, any of these other boletes in Wisconsin, you really should identify them to species so that you know you're picking the same thing every time you're out picking. And then you want to start by eating a small amount of them first and not eat a whole bunch the first time because then you could get sick. And you know, it wouldn't be a serious illness, but it would be a day or two of not feeling great. Michael Quo is a mycologist who does say that he has a bad reaction to many of the red cap boletes, and he says it's awful. So there are things like that, but you're not going to make a deadly mistake harvesting boletes, especially Porcini in Wisconsin. And we'll talk more about the lookalikes after this. So poisonous boletes, there aren't really any in Wisconsin, and they're very safe for beginners, boletes in general. What are some common methods of identifying boletes? So when you talk about different shapes of mushrooms and ways that we differentiate the genre in those different shapes, what we're talking about is sort of shared characteristics and the differentiations between them. So in terms of gilled mushrooms, it's the way that gills maybe attach to the stem, or how close or spread apart those gills are, things like that. Generally, a lot of the boletes are going to have similar olive brown spore prints. So it's not as valuable to take a spore print with a lot of the boletes. A lot of the things we're looking for are things like, does it bruise? Where does it bruise? Does it bruise on at the base of the stem like the Scaberstock boletes do? Or does it bruise in the flesh? If it does bruise in the flesh inside the cap, how quickly does it do it? If you crack it open, does it immediately turn blue? Does it do so over time? Does the pore surface turn blue? We will talk a little bit about some of the bluing boletes that are in the Porcini clade. Supposedly there is only one, but I have found this year, especially, some more sneaky bluers. So we'll talk more about that. And then what color is it? Obviously, and reticulation on the stem is very important when differentiating Porcini clade boletes. So does it have any reticulation on the stem? What does the stem look like? What color is it? What color is that reticulation? So we'll talk a little more about all that. So identifying edible boletes in the edulis clade. The edulis clade is the term for all the boletes that are closely related to Boletus edulis, which is the type species for Porcini, and the type species for boletes in general, honestly. But bolete, the Porcini clade boletes have a wide variety of appearance and species differentiation. There's a lot of debate about which species is which falls where. If I remember correctly, we had something either 6 or 9 species. I believe it was 6 species I think it was 9 species in Wisconsin last year, and now we're down to 4 or 5, just because they are rearranging where they have put these different boletes and what they're calling them. For example, there's a debate right now as whether Boletus chippewaensis even exists or whether it's just Boletus edulis. So what we're looking at here is Boletus chippewaensis, named after the Chippewa forest in Michigan where it was first found, which was named after the Ojibwe people, the Chippewa people. And what we see here is sort of a red maroon cap and an extremely light colored stem, white stem with this beautiful fishing net. This is sort of a picture perfect Porcini here. And kind of you got the big bulbous base and the netting on the stem. So you're looking for that netted reticulation on the stipe. So when we're talking about Porcini, one of the things that throws people off is that they will they'll look in their guidebook, and even like a really good guidebook for Wisconsin, like the Baroni book, the Baroni Field Guide. you'll look in your guidebook and it'll say something like Boletes edulis, and then it will talk about, or it'll show a picture of it, and the picture will look basically nothing like what you've got in your hands, or maybe it looks very, very different, or just different enough that it gives you that question. So when it comes to like a chanterelle, there isn't a lot of variability in what chanterelles look like. There's some shape differences, but they're all basically the same color. They all have false gills, especially in Wisconsin. So it's very easy for people to kind of differentiate, is this, you've got different species of chanterelles, they just pick what they think they're chanterelles. But if you have different species of Porcini, there's a lot of variation. And so I'm going to show a lot of. Just a girl. Brenda, if you could mute, thank you. There's a lot of variation in Porcini, and we'll talk more about that. But basically, you're looking for this list of characteristics to all apply, and that's a netted reticulation on the stem, as you can see here. White pores that you can see here that turn yellow quickly with age, within a couple of days of them opening, the cap really opening up here. The inner flesh should be white with occasional sort of pink tones, depending on the species, especially towards the edges of that flesh. The cap color is highly variable, but it's always sort of in the red to yellow, brick colored, water colored sort of appearance. It's rarely a matte color. In the exception to that would be like Boletus pseudopanophyllus or Boletus subseriolescens, and we'll talk more about those. But rarely turning blue. So like I said earlier, there's really only two that I know of. Boletus subseriolescens, which had an amazing year this year, and we'll talk more about that. And what we are calling Boletus chippewensis, or what I have identified as Boletus chippewensis, or just Boletus edulis, except for it's bluing in an interesting way, and I'll show you what it does there. But no bitter taste either. So if you took a little nibble out of this fresh mushroom and spit it out, it shouldn't be bitter. And we'll talk about that probably right now. Oh wait, no. First we're going to talk about variations on the theme. So all these were harvested in a single day in a red pine plantation on Madeline Island. So here we can see four completely different species of Porcini clade Boletes. So over here we have that one we just saw, and this is what I would call Boletus edulis or Boletus chippewensis. And the reason they call it chippewensis is this red sort of tinge to the cap. They said that was really the differentiation between edulis, at least the morphological features. There's argument, there's debate. But here we see what we would call probably Boletus. Well, let's see. No, this would probably be edulis, and this would be, something like nobilis. I can't remember on this one, but we're looking at the reticulation on the stipe here, the different colored cap. This one's a little older, so you can see the pores are turning yellow, whereas these are still white. Here we have Boletus subseriolescens with the darker reticulation. So this is kind of an exception, whereas usually you're looking for a white stem, white reticulation. Boletus subseriolescens has a darker sort of maroon matte cap and darker reticulation. And then here we have what up last year I would be calling Variipes. I'm not sure what they're calling now. I think Variipes did stay Variipes. This one might be like Frustulosa or something. Like I said, I can't keep track of what they're putting these in.
They're Artie, if I could just say real quick, so how we're teaching it, because this is just for anybody who doesn't know, Artie knows quite a lot about this. It's just that it is very up in the air right now. What we were doing for the mushroom certification class right now is treating them all as Boletus edulis. Just say Boletus edulis clade, and then have it be that the white reticulation, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I haven't actually observed a lot of these up close. Perhaps compared to you, for that one that has the dark reticulation, would you say that the reticulation is still white up by the cap?
Yes, and is that Pseudopanopoulos, if I remember correctly, bruises a lot of variation, and yeah, they are moving them around. I don't like the idea at all of just calling these all edulis in any sort of a permanent way, or edulis clade. There's a lot of, just because there's a lot of variation and there's a lot of species that are sort of similar doesn't mean we need to give up on classifying them, I think. So we will get there eventually to differentiating everything that's in Wisconsin. And citizen science is important in doing that. There's the Myco Blitz going on right now. So if you find any Porcini for one more day and you want to send them in for that, that's a great way of doing it. But anyway, so we have these four, but the point is that they all have the reticulation, the white pores turning yellow, different sort of color to the cap, and they're growing with different trees. So they're all mycorrhizal, obviously, but the subcerealescence I find growing with red and white pine, sometimes jack pine as well, and then edulis or chippewensis is often growing with aspen and oak, and then variipes I found with red pine as well, or this yellow cap one that I'm calling variipes. So here's a few more pictures. Here's subcerealescence from this year, just absolutely gorgeous mushrooms. They look very similar to the needles that they grow in, the pine needles they grow in. Here you can see beautiful white reticulation on these chippewensis from the island last year, and another chippewensis, this one just showing how the pores turn yellow with age. Sorry. And you can see, so when you're looking for this netting, the netting can wash off with the rain. So I usually tell people, if they're picking any mushrooms and you think like, oh, uh, I think this is this mushroom, but it's not showing this specific characteristic. Like, for example, a very specific example of this would be like if you were picking Leucoagaricus leucophytes, the white dapperling mushroom, which I don't ever recommend people pick because it looks almost identical to the destroying angel, where the only real difference for an amateur would be that it doesn't have a sort of cupped base like the destroying angel does. So maybe you're picking white dapperlings and you're like, oh, I know this is a white dapperling, but the base, I accidentally broke it off and I can't see the base. I really think it is though. Like, you're not going to eat that mushroom. Whereas with chippewensis, where with porcini, if I found this and it had been pouring rain and the reticulation had basically, it doesn't really wash off, but it kind of gets saturated with water and it becomes basically invisible to see unless you're looking very carefully up near the top here. So this is kind of the exception to that rule, where like I do pick porcini that obviously I if it's got a white stem and everything else is characteristic, eventually you just get the eye for it. But oftentimes this netting will wash off, or at least disappear in rain or with bruising or slugs. So these pictures are all sort of the best case scenario of when you'll see that reticulation. Here we see a different species that I picked this year that looks very much like the European edulis that I picked down at Houghton Falls near Washburn. So just lots of variation. These were just absolutely gorgeous, thick, wormless. And here we see some chippewensis, or what I am calling chippewensis for lack of a better name, growing in Cornucopia, Wisconsin, with these extremely long stems. And almost everything out here today, that day that we were picking, had extremely long stems like this. So there's some sort of environmental factors that cause basically all the mushrooms to grow really long stems. So there's can be some, environmental differences. There can be all kinds of differences that you're looking for. So this day, these all just did not look like your typical stout porcini, but sure enough, they were Porcini. Here's another one that I have yet to, it shows a lot of different variation, but it was growing right next to, or there were several of these that looked identical growing right next to some different Chippewaensis. And you can see this one has extreme pink flesh when cut open. It has this recessed area around the stem and a really sort of dome bun shaped cap. So that one, again, variations, and this one would probably just be called edulis right now. But I am not, if anyone has any better ideas, definitely speak up on that. So here we see, this was this year, we had an absolute wonderful fruiting, and these are all subserulescents popping up out of the needle duct. And once you kind of, there was tons and tons of lexinum that looked basically identical to these, except for they were a little more matte brown on the cap. So eventually you just get the eye for them and you're kicking over the lexinum and picking up the Porcini. But at first it's definitely tough to tell the difference. So lookalikes, the top lookalikes here, we have Tylopolis phelleus, the bitter bolete. That's basically the false Porcini, or what gets the name. It's not poisonous. As we said, there's no poisonous boletes in Wisconsin, but it is extremely bitter. And it gets more bitter when you cook it. My uncle actually cooked this thinking it was king boletes, and his pan, because he couldn't cook it anymore. Everything was bitter. And it's tylopin is the chemical, the bitter chemical in the mushrooms. So they have a pink pore surface when they age instead of yellow. So if you find them when they're older, you don't even have to take a nibble and see if it's bitter, but you can take a nibble, and that will definitely tell you definitively. Although I have found these with extremely low levels of tylopin that are basically not bitter at all. So learning that the pores change to pink, and they do have always dark reticulation over a lighter colored stem. So dark reticulation over a lighter colored stem, whereas that subserulescence is more maroon overall. And then here's Imlaria pallida, the pallid bolete. Very similar in appearance to Porcini, with a white, real nice white stem and sort of a brown cap. But these will bruise blue underneath, blue-gray, especially and quickly, especially the older ones. The younger ones will not bruise as well, and they also do not have any reticulation on the stem. So it looks kind of like they do from even pretty close up, but if you look closer, it's just a smooth sort of fibrous stem. And then here we have Hemilexinum subglabripes. This is one that always tricks me from the top. It really looks like a Porcini on the cap, and then as soon as you look underneath, you'll see that it has a bright yellow stem with sort of a pink tinge and very bright yellow pores. This picture doesn't actually do it justice. Oh, and this is Michael Kuo's photo. All the photos will be mine except for this one. Michael Kuo, Renee LeBeouf did this one, and Michael Kuo did this one as well. So those would be the three in my mind that really stick out as being lookalikes. The Skaber stock boletes certainly are as well, but they have the black Skabers on the stock instead of reticulation. So they really are obviously not Porcini. So Porcini around the world. Porcini are absolutely prized all around the world. Probably one of the most prized mushrooms behind truffles. We, like I said, do not really appreciate them here. My theory behind that is because in the United States, especially the Midwest, our method for cooking mushrooms starts and ends at frying them in butter. And Porcini are really not best served that way. The exception being if you get really nice small buttons, like these ones in the picture on the left are pretty nice, and cook them and serve them in certain ways. They are not nearly as strongly flavored unless they're dried, and the texture of almost all boletes tends to be kind of a chewy, spongy, hard to enjoy texture for most people. So that's why I think people generally don't like them or consider them really a choice edible here is because they cook some up, especially some of the older ones in butter, and they're kind of spongy and they're like kind of okay flavored, but it's nothing special, and so they don't really look for them again. Whereas if you treat them properly, and we'll talk about how to do that, they're one of the best mushrooms in the world. So here we have on the left, this is a picture I took in San Sebastian in the Basque Country in northern Spain. San Sebastian is one of the best places for gourmet food in the world. It has the most Michelin-starred restaurants per capita. And every single bar, this was in the fall, every single bar we went into, every restaurant had a display like this, beautiful display of mushrooms, Amanita caesaria, black trumpets, chanterelles, saffron milk caps, and of course, porcini at center stage. And it was absolutely wonderful. Just to see how revered they were by everyday people, and enjoyed in all sorts of different ways, specials on every menu, and absolutely fantastic. You can see some of the pinchos, the tapas here at the bottom. You know, each one of these is like $2. God knows how good it was. Here's me over in Colorado picking the rubra under bristlecone pine. These trees are, you know, 2,000-3,000 years old, and I just would love to know how old the mycelium underneath them is. So Colorado is a great spot for porcini. Here's a porcini out in Oregon. There's coastal porcini and one's further in the forest. This is one deeper into the forest. The coastal porcini are definitely the prize. They're bigger, they're meatier. And here's a rubra ceps over here as well from Colorado. Again, is usually meatier than our Chippewaensis. The exception would be really the meatiest and best that I've seen grow here in great numbers is the subcereal essence, and we'll talk about that. And the reason that it's good to get those big meaty ones is you can get a button like this that is very nice quality, and you can dry it really well and get just a lot of the high quality mushrooms. And we'll talk about, you know, what different qualities are. Here's why they call it the King Bolete. This is the biggest one I've ever seen, that I found out in Telluride with my wife Peyton here. She's got a hawkswing in her hand. So a couple years ago, they had just an absolutely amazing year for porcini. You can see a couple in the back here, and we were each just absolutely loaded up, probably well over 200 pounds that we all picked that day in a couple hours.
Arne, I've got preparation. When they're that big, yep. Are there bugs in them?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're gonna talk about that. This one is definitely all the way gone. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that is one of the things about porcini is the bigger they get, the worse they are, but also the harder it is to say no because they're so darn big. So moving on, preparation. Why don't people in the U.S. appreciate porcini? Well, we kind of talked about that already. What can porcini teach us about cooking mushrooms? So for me, what porcini really taught me several years ago about cooking mushrooms is using mushrooms for what historically they've been used for, and expanding upon the experience of chefs who've been doing this for hundreds or thousands of years. And what I mean by that is that you've got, you know, pros and cons, or I should say strengths and weaknesses for every mushroom in the kitchen. Chanterelles have a fantastic sort of sweet flavor, so they can be used in all sorts of interesting dishes. I've had cobblers and pies and stuff, which is not to say that you can't do something like that with porcini. Chad Hyatt has a wonderful porcini blueberry ice cream, but it's not, it's a contradiction in your mouth. It's a wonderful contradiction, but certainly a contradiction in your mouth. So kind of experimenting with those weaknesses and strengths can be really important, but just expanding on, or just following in the footsteps of traditional preparations. In Italy, you know, porcini is the name that is most commonly known by around the world. That's the name you'll find it in grocery stores as. But that's the Italian name, and the reason, you know, that name is kind of stuck, I think, is because they just have an absolute love for porcini. and they've kind of evangelized it to the world in their dishes. So if you've ever had a good mushroom risotto at a Italian restaurant, that's porcini. If you've ever like the true basis of many of the most famous sauces that we eat and enjoy are traditionally porcini, like ragu. Both ragu Neapolitano and ragu Bolognese are made with porcini as the base, and pancetta usually, ground pork and veal and all sorts of other good things. But porcini, dried porcini as the base. And so using them in those traditional recipes and just see how it improves your spaghetti sauce to add dried porcini. Just start there, and go from there. What recipes work best for porcini? Some of my favorites are, like I said, ragu, Alfredo, coq au vin, risotto, and gravies. Really, any like rich sauce where the base of the sauce is not going to overpower the mushrooms, but they're going to sort of add to it and expound on it. So, like as an example, how I would make a ragu. Really, any sort of darker sauce, you're going to start with your porcini, and then add. So if I start with your porcini, I should say almost always I'm using dried porcini, and we'll talk about how to do that next. But dried porcini is a stronger flavor. It has a wonderful aroma. It really brings out that deep, meaty flavor in the mushroom. The quality of the mushrooms you've dried. And we'll talk about that. The pan, because you don't want a big piece of a spongy textured mushroom. If it's a button and has a nice texture to it, it's a little better to get a bigger piece of it, because then you get some, you actually get a piece of mushroom that you're chewing on, and that can be enjoyable, not just the flavor of it. But for a lot of the times, I will dice up the freshly rehydrated porcini, save that water that we rehydrated it in, add, say, shallots, garlic, or onions, and then it kind of depends on where you're going. But like for a darker sauce, you'd want to use a sofrito, which is the Italian word for what we would call the Holy Trinity. It's mirepoix in France. But basically it's celery, carrots, and onions is the traditional trio. You can expound on that. If you don't like celery, leave it out. It's really up to you. I do celery, carrots, onions, and garlic is my sofrito. So I'll put in sofrito, which is all finely chopped up, with my porcini, and kind of brown all of it a little bit without burning it onto the bottom of the pan. Take it out of the pan, put in a ground meat like pork, or beef, or venison, and brown that in the pan next to add to that fond that we're building on the bottom, again without burning. So you're trying to brown without burning. So keep adding oil in small increments so that nothing burns, and keep it on low heat. Once the meat is browned, you add your sofrito and porcini mixture back in, and now you have the base for so many good things. You could make a ragu by adding a can of tomatoes and some bay leaves and some tomato paste first and some red wine. You could make a coq au vin with red wine and chicken instead of the beef. You could make a gravy by adding a brown roux. So it's really a lot you can do, and it's very easy to sort of switch different ingredients. You can make a cream sauce by leaving out the sofrito, just doing the porcini. You can make an Alfredo by just doing the porcini, shallots, and garlic, some white wine to get that fond off, to deglaze the pan, and then adding cream and Parmesan. One of my favorite easy recipes. So recipes, I've got lots of them. If you are really interested in getting like a more detailed version of any of the recipes I talked about from me, you can certainly ask, although all of these are very traditional recipes, and really experimenting with your own ingredients and making it your own way can be really fun and easy. So, and then here's an example of preparations. These were both in, well, the first one here on the left was in Spain at that restaurant that I showed you earlier. This is how they were preparing them. I would literally point to what mushroom I wanted, and they would cook it in a lot of high quality olive oil. You can see there's like a pool of olive oil on the plate there. They love their olive oil. And two absolutely perfectly, I don't even know if you could call them poached egg yolks. They're basically raw egg yolks that have just been stuck together by heat. And you know, that combination of the fresh, really high quality buttons and the good egg yolk is just unbelievably decadent. And then here on the right, this was in Siena, Italy. This is a Michelin-starred restaurant, and this dish, you know, you think Michelin-starred restaurant over there, or our version, in our Michelin-starred restaurant, you pay $500, you sit down to a 15-course meal or whatever. Michelin-starred restaurants are these high quality restaurants. They take all sorts of different forms around the world. You know, there's little stalls in Tokyo that are Michelin-starred. In this case, this was in a cave, in a 2,000-year-old cave. And this whole meal that we had, it was maybe 4 or 5 courses, and it was less than $150 for 2 people and wine. Like, honestly, our appreciation for food is so lacking in this country, and our demand for affordable, high quality ingredients is so low that it is an eye opener to go to some of these countries that really appreciate. You can see there's white truffle shaved on top. That's like cannelloni. So it's pasta with fresh porcini and a ricotta cheese or bechamel inside, and these white truffle shaved on top. And this was I think $8, you know, as an appetizer. Just unreal. So, you know, and this isn't something that you can get in a restaurant around here, but it's something you can make yourself, and it's absolutely wonderful. Takes a little work, but you know, you could make 40 of these and freeze them. Um, so moving on to preservation. Um, like I said, boletes generally taste better dried. Basically, all boletes. The hemilexinum that we saw earlier, the porcini looking ones on top with the yellow stems, are extremely common in Wisconsin, and they're delicious when dried. I would start with a small amount, like I said, with almost any other bolete, but definitely a good mushroom. And you want to dry almost all mushrooms for culinary purposes at 95 to 110 degrees until they're cracker dry, like a saltine cracker. If you do that, you can keep this sort of white look. This is before they're dried. This was one mushroom. So you can see how a perfect porcini can really fill up a dehydrator quick. You know, I picked maybe 100 mushrooms on this day in a couple hours, and my dehydrators were running for several days nonstop afterwards just to keep up. So then I would vacuum seal or store them in mason jars. There's tons of traditional preparation techniques over in Europe. Loved in Eastern Europe, Lithuania, people will fight each other in the same family over a porcini. You know, mom and dad will rush to the ground and push each other over for it. It's an obsession, and the that sort of overabundance that some people get sometimes leads to a lot of interesting preservation techniques. I've heard of them pickled. I've heard of them fermented, and all sorts of weird things that people do smoked. There's a fantastic soup that they make on the spot in Eastern Europe when they find porcini. Often, they just, as they're harvesting, sit down and make porcini soup. So lots of different recipes out there, and definitely, you know, explore and try different things. But I tend to dry them. This was in so getting creative. So porcini are one of the few mushrooms that do not last very long, no matter how you try to keep them. So, you know, you can if you get a perfect porcini button and you put it in a paper bag in the fridge, it'll last a couple weeks. But if they have any worms in them at all, they're going to get eaten alive. And whether or not they have worms is really dependent on where you're harvesting them and what time of year it is. Here in Wisconsin, if it's any time before like September 20th, which is their main season, to about now. If it's any time before that and you're finding porcini, there are summer flushes, they're going to be full of bugs. And you have to dry them immediately. I don't mind some bugs in my mushrooms, especially if I'm drying them. Bugs will dry out or they'll leave. But if you put them in your fridge, they'll be worthless. Especially if you're picking any that are kind of on the edge, like this big one here that I picked. And we'll talk about what it means to be on the edge. But so immediately cutting them up and drying them, getting creative. That means getting creative, especially if you're out home and you don't have a dehydrator. I had, like I said, 2 years ago, Colorado had the best porcini years. Staying at my friend's house who had this trampoline in his backyard. It was basically the perfect possible situation because you can just see how much I had to dry here. And this was every single day I had this much to dry for about 5 days in a row. So it just would have been impossible for me to do it any other way. So I got really lucky here. And getting creative is necessary. I've done all sorts of things, buy a dehydrator and sell it on eBay when you get home if you need to. Whatever you got to do to get her done. But part of that can be, so like, how do we preserve them if we say we pick some and we have only a couple days, to store them until we're going to get home? Well, get a cooler, keep them in a cooler, make sure you cut out all the bugs, only keep the best ones. There are ways to prolong that time until you can get them to a dryer. So keeping track of how you're picking. Like this one, it has to be cut up at night, or it's just not for the next day, especially this pore surface isn't. And we'll chat more about that. When to say. So this was harvested early on in the summer, and so what I did was the pores were pretty gnarly. They're maybe even darker than this. So as they get older, they go from yellow to sort of an olive brown color. And as soon as they're past this sort of yellow color, I won't take them. I won't include them in the mushroom if I'm keeping the rest of the mushroom. So what I'll do is I'll remove the pores. You can see I did that here. What I found when I removed the pores on these ones, as I was saying earlier, is they turn blue underneath, which I have no idea what species that is. So if someone knows what species this is that turns blue underneath the pore surface, I would love to hear it. It's very interesting. But I know it's in the Porcini clade because it's got the reticulation on the stem. It follows all the other rules. But if you remove that pore surface, you get it comes off very easily. And if it doesn't come off easily, toss the mushroom. If the pores just won't come off without ripping whole spongy parts of the mushroom off, it's all too far gone. In that case, sometimes what I do is I'll cut the stem off and save the stem, because the stem stays firm long after the cap of the mushroom, usually if it's not full of bugs, is gone. So I kind of just feel what's the firmest and still white fleshed inside, and sometimes I'll take that. But anything that I'm like salvaging like that, that's going to go separate in a separate section of the dehydrator and be bagged separately for like being powdered or diced up really small, because the texture isn't going to be as good as those premium buttons. And so this was earlier in the summer, so I had to do a lot of this. I had to take off the pores, I had to cut off the stems. Sometimes they'll get yellow inside the stem right at the base. And if the flesh is turning yellow in there, again, I toss the whole thing. That's kind of a sign that it's pretty old. You don't want to give yourself food poisoning. Don't eat old mushrooms. The rule is universal when it comes to harvesting mushrooms. If it's too good to be true, it often is, and sometimes it's better just to leave it. here we can see this is subserulescence. Once they started kicking off really, really hard a couple of weeks ago. Some people are saying it's one of the best. Alan Burgo is saying it's the best Porcini season he's seen in 10 years. I don't know if I agree with that, just because I've seen a completely different area and a couple weeks earlier. So diversity, and so many of these different edulis clade here, another one will be, which is great for us because we get an excellent Porcini season. But you can see, so I started getting large amounts of the subserulescence. The subserulescence also does bruise underneath, and you can see that here just a little bit. It's kind of a blue gray color, and then it turns purple brown within about an hour. So you can see these bruises are now purple brown. So they call it the almost bluing king bolete, because it really only blues for about 10 minutes, and if you catch it, you bruise it, and then within 10 minutes it starts to kind of get a little blue, and you rarely see it.
Real quick, your audio has been kind of spotty. If you could potentially, I know it might be your internet, but like if you're blocking any of the microphone.
Yeah, how's that? Is that any better?
That is better, I think. Thank you.
Yeah. So we can see that they do turn a little blue underneath, and this is just, I picked every day. I went out for about the last 3 weeks and picked this much Porcini. I probably picked 400 pounds of Porcini this year. It's absolutely ridiculous. And then you can see this was just last week when it really cooled down. You can see there's a few worms in here, and they're coming up from the base. So what I was doing, normally what I'll do is I'll carve the base of it if it's a perfect button, because I want to keep all that flesh. If there's worms crawling up to the base, then I'll just cut off until there's no worms. I'll look in, or until there's just a few holes left, and then I'll keep the rest of it. And the caps of these were all wormless, and you can see that the pores are just almost still white, and you can keep all of this. So really, the late season Porcini are the best, and they go pretty late. September 25th for me, way up north here is when they start, and they go to mid-October until a frost. So that is all I have in terms of slides, because I did this very last minute. But
and to be clear,
a little more,
that's on us. Arne has very graciously taken on this presentation for us with about 48 hours notice that we realized we didn't have an October presenter. So big thank you to Arne for that, because we all got to get out and get some Porcini. There have been some pictures came in the chat, and I think every single one of them, although it's just a personal identification from a photo, between Melissa and I, we were like, yeah, that's Porcini. So you could, I don't know if you can access the chat, Arne.
For example, if you have to stay on top of them if you're picking anything like this. You do not want to over harvest. You don't want to pick this big pile of porcini and leave it in my fridge for 2 or 3 days, because then half of these would be just not worth keeping anymore. They get really pretty gnarly pretty quick. So you really have to be staying on top of drying them, preserving them. Do not go out and pick more if you have a bunch in your fridge still. I do that all the time. But, do as I say, not as I do. So definitely, don't over harvest. They are, the difference in the amount of work between this harvest and this harvest, even though they're similar in size, is massive, because a bunch of these I didn't want to keep the pores on this one. I took all those off, and that takes a little while. And then once you do that, you kind of cut off some of the other parts, and they might need to be cleaned too, and all this other stuff. These, I basically was like cutting up mushrooms from the store, slicing them up, throwing them in the dehydrator. It took me about an hour. There was almost no waste that I had to remove or get rid of here. So, some people, a lot of people, most people, especially in Europe, and people who hunt Porcini traditionally, will only take those nice little products. Not only because usually that's plenty, but because it's a lot less work. And oftentimes they want to eat them fresh, and then that's a bonus to get them when they're young. So when you harvest them in the older stages, you just have to know that it's not going to be the same product, and you need to dry them and use them. The flavor is going to be identical. The texture is going to be a little different. And the amount of work that you put in is going to be different. And as with any mushroom, just when you have tossed out, it's really easy at the beginning of the season to harvest. Everything you see is already
Hey Arnie, you're cutting out really bad right now. Can we just pause for a second?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry about that. I'm about finished anyways.
That's better.
We could probably go to the Q&A. Yeah, I think the Q&A. I'm gonna see if I can get my internet.
Anyone who wants to unmute at this point can feel free to do that and ask a question. Otherwise, feel free to write a question in the chat and we will relay it to Arnie for you.
Hey Arnie, if you could just repeat what you said about removing the pore surface. You kind of cut out there a lot, and I wasn't sure when you do it and when you don't.
Yeah, so the pores here, if you could see here, can you guys see my mouse when I'm moving it? I suppose it probably.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, yeah. So if you can see here, like the difference in color between this one and this one is when I would remove the pores. This one personally, I would keep the pores on when there's still this yellow color. As soon as you see a lot of the spore deposit, the brown on them, I will take those pores off. And then if in removing, usually I start by getting my fingernails underneath here near the base of the stem and pulling out, and it should come off around the edge like a donut in one big piece. And if it doesn't, if it's if you're struggling to get it off, or if there's big chunks of the mushroom coming off, it'll get really spongy with age. The flesh will. If that's the case, I just toss it out. I won't keep any of it. Maybe the base of the stem if that's still nice and firm.
Possibly could I ask, I'm going to ask a few questions that came in on the chat. And then somebody else can go next if they want to unmute themselves. I don't want to take up all the time, but so speed run of those questions. Claire had asked if you could name that cave restaurant again, where it was or what it's
yeah, that restaurant. One moment. Should be able to, there we go. That restaurant was called there's two. We went to both of them. The one that we enjoyed the most, I believe, there was Osteria de Divo. This one was the second one we went to where I had that cannellini. And the first one we went to might have been the Checo, this one. There's two of them in there. They're both in these 2,000-year-old Tuscan wine cellars, and they're absolutely amazing. Both of them are Michelin starred.
Sorry, I go to Italy.
Okay, so I've put that in the chat just for reference. And then there was some of the other questions from the chat that didn't get answered by Melissa first. Was about what about Boletus huronensis?
Yeah.
Ellen is saying, is it found in Wisconsin? How do I identify it? I've heard eating that is a very unpleasant experience. I don't know what you've heard, Arnie, but I've heard it's basically like Pennsylvania and further east.
Yes, we do not have Boletus huronensis. At least there are no recorded sightings here. You certainly could be the first to find one, so you do want to know what it looks like, especially if you're going to be hunting out east. Here we can see it. So there is a sort of a famous, this story is actually the one talking about this specific poisoning that happened in 2009 with Boletus hirenensis. At least that's what they believe it was. And it is an Eastern mushroom, so you certainly should learn it. It does have a faint bluing reaction, which would be a good indicator to separate it from some of the other edulis clade boletes and really narrow it down, or edulis clade looking boletes. This is not in the edulis clade, but so definitely a relatively easy mushroom to learn, but not especially necessary to learn in Wisconsin, because you would be the first to see it. Any more?
Yes. So just from the chat, sorry, the chat's kind of messing up for me a little bit.
I've got it.
Okay,
Glenn Goble says, are all the edible boletes autumn fruiting mushrooms?
No, there are definitely, well, basically the main mushroom season for most boletes and most diversity in general in Wisconsin is going to be the start of July, about July 15th through October 15th. So that's when you're most likely to see the edible boletes. You could certainly find some before that. The Hemilexinum subglabrides that I talked about is one that comes out before that. Really, Porcini is far and away the best and most universal in terms of its use. And it's really the one that I look for because I can find it in such abundance. And a lot of boletes, as if you try them, they have a sort of porcini flavor, but it's not really pales in comparison. So a lot of the boletes will have a very similar, they call it the bolete flavor. They do kind of all taste very similar, but different sort of varying levels of that meatiness and experimenting with the different edible boletes in Wisconsin is very safe. So if you want to do that, definitely give it a try, but start slow and only eat small amounts, separated by 48-hour increments, and make sure that you're picking the same species. If like this one is good on my stomach, and then next year you go out to pick it, if you're picking a different species, you might not have the same experience. So knowing exactly what you're picking is important in that case.
I've also heard recently, haven't had a chance to verify this, that it's good to start off with the mushrooms that are easier to digest for you and just kind of work your way up, because you're kind of helping your gut bacteria learn to digest mushrooms.
Yeah, that's a definitely, I would, that intuitively makes sense to me. I'd have to look into more of the info.
That's what
on
I
that.
thought.
But it is one of those things where there are certain mushrooms that are just easier to digest. Those are the choice edibles. Porcini is one of those mushrooms you can give to anyone on Earth, and there's a very, very low chance that they're going to have any sort of allergic or physical reaction to it. Basically, the same amount as if you gave someone, a lemon or something, a pretty non-reactive or non fruit or food that doesn't tend to give people allergic reactions. It's not like peanuts, even, where there's a high percentage of people who have allergic reactions. So with chanterelles, black trumpets, porcini, those are all sort of things that I just serve to people. I just gave some porcini to an elderly woman at a retirement home. It's one of those things where even I don't want to poison an old lady at a retirement home, so I'm not going to give her some scaber stock boletes and anything like that. So
this is the kind of stand up ethical behavior we are in favor of here at WMS.
Exactly. Be extra careful with any of the non-choice edible mushrooms out there. When it comes to porcini, you can enjoy it.
Jeannie Rockney asked, where is a good place to store your mushrooms after they are dried? Are freezer Ziploc bags okay?
And then
Yeah,
Jessica,
definitely.
glass mason jars.
Yeah, so if you get them to cracker dry, since we live in a very humid environment, once you get them to that saltine cracker dry, you have to completely cut them off from all air unless you're going to store them with desiccant packets. So if you get silica desiccant packets, you can buy them in bulk online. Then you can store your mushrooms in like a gallon freezer Ziploc bag, and just store them with a couple desiccant packets because they will keep them nice and dry. Once you dry, I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. If someone's trying to talk, or maybe that might have been extra.
I think that might have been a mistake.
Okay.
Can
Once
you
they're
freeze them? Can you just freeze them?
Yeah, so like some of the I will freeze occasionally some of the really nice buttons, you know, slice them and freeze them. Then you can put them straight into a pan. You don't want to thaw them out, but you put them straight into a pan and you can serve them fresh still that way. But really, I don't really enjoy them fresh. There's the only way I've ever enjoyed them fresh was that dish that I showed, those couple dishes that I showed from Europe, where they're really sort of expounding on the subtleties of the fresh version of the mushroom, and using it in very specific ways. So definitely try that and save some fresh ones to use them in different ways and see how you like them. See, you know, they're really good in omelets and scrambled eggs, things like that. But I generally dry most of mine. And yeah, so putting desiccant packets in a freezer bag is the way to go. Other than that, vacuum sealing and using a mason jar. And you can vacuum seal mason jars as well. It's a little bit of overkill if you put the mushroom in when it's cracker dry. Once you stabilize mushrooms, once you get all the water out, they're pretty much going to be okay, even if they're not that cracker dry. But you do want, for really long-term storage, if you want to pass them down to your kids, that's how you want to do it.
And someone asked, can you freeze them instead of drying them?
Yeah, and like I said, you can freeze the fresh buttons, slice them and freeze them. What I would honestly do though is maybe make some dishes that you like using, you know, try them fresh in a dish and then see if you like that, then make that dish in bulk and freeze that. You know, sometimes I like them fresh in like a ravioli. So I'll make have a pasta day, make a ton of pasta, make a bunch of raviolis, make a bunch of porcini filling, and freeze them all. And then you can pull out a few raviolis whenever you want in the winter.
I recommend, if people are going to be freezing mushrooms also, that what I found works best, at least in my kitchen, is that you at least partially cook them. Like put them in a pan, let them like exude all their water until they suck it all back up. And that's the point where you take them out and freeze them. And also vacuum sealing does wonders for helping them stay nice and fresh for like eons into the future versus putting them in a Ziploc bag. I've put something in my freezer for a month or two and gone to use it out of a Ziploc and it's been freezer burnt, but vacuum sealing eliminates that weird freezer phenomenon. So I highly recommend getting a vacuum sealer. And if anyone wants to get a recommendation for a vacuum sealer, I bought mine 2 or 3 months ago. I replaced the Food Saver one that I had because I break a Food Saver vacuum sealer every single year, apparently, as a sacrifice to the gods. And I bought a new one and I dropped it just like I dropped every other one. And it actually made it through the drop, and it's called Galaxy. And I bought it from stupid like webrestaurantstore.com or something like that, but it was a good purchase and I like the brand. So
yeah, having a good vacuum sealer is super helpful for a lot of things. So I recommend just biting the bullet and doing that. It really saves your frozen goods for a lot longer. And you have a lot of freezers that go through like defrost cycles and things like that, and you can ruin whole batches of food if they're not properly stored. So definitely using a vacuum sealer is the ideal, or storing in mason jars if you're talking about dried mushrooms. But don't use mason jars in a freezer because they can crack with that cold, obviously.
Kate Plashetka asks, there was a mushroom museum mentioned at the beginning of the talk. Where is that?
Mushroom museum. Did I mention a mushroom museum? Oh, I think what you're referring to is the Cable Natural History Museum, where I do talks every year. I don't think I mentioned any other type of museum, although when you start looking at things like that, like mushroom museums, mushroom art exhibits, mushroom porcini festivals, they're all in Europe. Almost all of them, of course, and it goes back to that massive level of appreciation. When I was going to Europe in October of last year, I was looking up some festivals and stuff because I wanted to make sure that I took advantage of the fall harvest. But there are festivals in almost every town, and every single farmer's market and every restaurant had mushrooms, so it wasn't really hard to look. They're highly enjoyed over there. But no, I don't know of any mushroom museums in our area.
Walker asked, if boletes get more flavorful with age after they're dried, then how long after drying is the best rate of return for flavor? Great question.
Yeah, it is a great question. I would say that they actually, I think I should be a little more clear. They get better as soon as they're dry. So you'll smell them, as you're dehydrating them, your entire house will start to just overwhelmingly smell like these mushrooms. And when they're dry, that's it really, just the process of drying is what does it. So it really they don't need to be aged any extra amount of time. Although I have found that when they do age, in my opinion, the quality seems to decrease a little, especially if you haven't really properly stored them. I mean, we're talking about 3-4-year-old batches of mushrooms, but I've noticed it becomes more subtle. It's not as pronounced. In my opinion, or at least my sort of gut feeling, is that a lot of that flavor comes from sort of a controlled process of decay. And so you're basically, eating dried decayed mushrooms, or controlled decayed mushrooms. And so that sort of reek that comes from them is most prominent, in my opinion, right after you dry them. Not to put you off on the on the flavor, but it is a very strong flavor. It's wonderful, but it's strong.
There's 2 cooking questions for you as well. Mary asks, oh, hold on just a second. Do you have a preferred method of rehydrating for porcini in cooking use? And then there was another one. Can you repeat the saute method of cooking?
Yeah, absolutely. Those kind of go hand in hand, so that's perfect. When you're rehydrating, when you're slicing up the mushrooms for drying, I don't go thicker than about a 1/4 inch. Once you go thicker than that, it takes a long time to dry them, and also you have pieces that tend to be more of a chewy texture, pieces that are too thick and don't rehydrate fully, or stay kind of cardboardy, and especially stem pieces. So you don't want to get too big of stem pieces, or at least you have to take into account that they're going to take longer to rehydrate. But generally, it's going to be just a couple minutes in some warm water, just enough warm water to cover them. I use about a large heaping handful for any dish I'm making. If you really want it to be a porcini center dish, it might be more than that. But generally, it's going to be a large handful, about a cup of dried mushrooms. You'll rehydrate them. I then kind of squeeze them a little bit to get some of that excess water out. Usually then I dice them up pretty fine, small chunks, and then saute them with olive oil to start, because butter will burn pretty quickly if you start a dish with butter. If you're trying to do like what I was saying, where you're sauteing multiple layers of ingredients, first you're sauteing your porcini, then your aromatic herbs or the sofrito, the celery, carrots, and onions, and then your meat, or whichever order you do it in. If you don't do that carefully and control small amounts of oil, and low heat, or at least just the right amount of heat to sear but not burn, you're going to end up, burning that fawn, which you don't want to do. And put in. So sauteing with olive oil, and sofrito, your herbs, and then using that water that you rehydrated them. It's basically mushroom stock, a wonderful mushroom stock. Usually I'll get some of the better than bouillon, beef bouillon, and mix it right into that mushroom stock, add a little extra water, and then put that in my beef sofrito porcini mix, and then cook it down, add a roux. You have a wonderful thick gravy, beef gravy. Or alternatively, if you're making an Alfredo, you take that water, since it's a dark stock, the water you use to rehydrate, and you keep it for tomorrow, because a dark stock does not go in an Alfredo. So understanding the difference between like meaty dark sauces and light sauces, and how to use the mushroom in each one is important. And don't burn it, but cook it thoroughly and brown it a little bit. The nice thing about porcini is that the flavor is not delicate. It changes a little bit with when you really brown the mushroom, but generally about the same. Whereas like with matsutake or truffle, heat will make that flavor just go away. That's not the case with porcini. So you don't have to be afraid of really cooking it thoroughly, crisping it up a little bit, and then adding it, using it as the base for whatever you're making.
Just to add on to that a little bit, Arne, other than the two you mentioned, like matsutake and truffles or whatever, I had a chef at one point tell me, like, don't be afraid to like really cook your mushrooms, because when you get caramelization on mushrooms, it actually adds like a lot more flavor. You get like a much more pleasant flavor on them. So I just want to kind of hit on that point, because I think you kind of covered it, but I just wanted to kind of like hit that home, that don't be afraid to really, really brown and cook your mushrooms. And if you start to see any burning, that's a problem. You don't want to do it on like super high heat for a very long periods of time. But if you have it on a nice like medium to medium low heat, you can actually cook mushrooms for like a decently long time and get them like fairly like crispy even, which is how I enjoy mine the most. There are a couple more questions, Arne, from the chat as well.
Yeah.
First of all, Walker asks, have anyone here ever tried sun drying their tomatoes for additional vitamin C? And then someone else asked,
You said D. Vitamin D.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. Vitamin D, yes, because the sun. I'm sorry. I knew that actually, but I don't know why I said that. I was trying to remember the next question, and that's
no problem.
The next question is frost. Do porcinis grow after the first frost still?
Yeah, so two great questions. So porcini, sometimes they will grow after the first frost. They're one of the latest that I do see out there. Usually it's like the first frost is kind of when I stop going out, or at least I move on to other stuff. And then I'll get a call a couple of weeks later that someone says, there's black trumpets and porcini out still. But usually it's not nearly in the same abundance. Like right now, we just had our last frost, or our first frost last week, and I haven't really, the porcini I'm seeing look like they got frosted, and I'm not seeing any more popping up now. So generally, I would say that's a pretty good sign that it's getting to be over, barring some fluke flushes after the frost. And then as far as sun drying mushrooms, yes, you should ideally you sun dry your mushrooms because they do soak up vitamin D. The problem with that is in our environment at this time of year, it's really humid and the days are short, and there's often not a lot of sun. So unless you have like a greenhouse and you're able to lay them out, you got like 2 or 3 sunny days in a row where you can lay them out, and it's going to take a couple days for them to dry, and you got to keep a fan on them. So it's kind of a tall order this time of year. What I like to do, that picture with the trampoline at work, because I was in Denver, and it was 80 degrees every day, and the sun is incredibly intense in Denver. But what I like to do sometimes, and this may not work at all, it's just something I do, is to take the bags of, or the jars of already dried porcini or nearly dried porcini, and put them in my window with the bag open or the cap open in the sun, to kind of finish up, or just to hopefully absorb some of that vitamin D. I don't know if they do absorb any of it once they're already fully dried. They probably don't, but I just kind of do it for in the vain hope that they might. And it's something you could do, or you could dry them half or almost all the way in your dehydrator and then put them in the sun to finish up. That would be an option as well.
There's another question in the chat that says, when you're picking porcini, do you wait for the cap to open before picking them? And how long does it take for the pores to turn from white to yellow?
Yeah, two great questions. So I personally do pick them. Like I said, my personal limit is like right about here, where this one is open, but it's still a little bit yellow.
We can't see your screen anymore,
Arnie.
Oh, sorry.
To help the audio, but you could reshare it if you want.
No, it's okay. So when when they've opened up and they've become completely flat or even upturned on the pore surface, they're going to start yellowing really quickly. The exception being the real cold weather ones, which tend to stay white and nice for longer. There are a lot of people, maybe even 40-50% of people, I would guess, who harvest porcini in a serious fashion, who only pick those perfect buttons before the cap is really opened up at all. And that's just to save themselves work, to get the best texture, and because usually those people are very spoiled in the amount of porcini they can pick. Whereas, I mean, you can see I am too, but I'm also just an insatiable fiend for porcini. So when they start to go from yellow to brown, that's when I choose to no longer pick them. And at the beginning of the season, I'm, like I said, more permissive in which ones I'll harvest, because I don't know how much I'm going to get throughout the season, and I eat a lot of it in the winter, so I want to make sure that I get enough. Near the end of the season, I'm just really picking those primo buttons because I know I already have enough. And there's no need to waste time and energy on ones that also are doing their job, spreading more spores for you. So leaving them to do their thing is the ideal.
There's a lot of people typing in to say thank you for all of your work tonight, Arnie.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, guys. I hope it was informative for being totally last minute.
Yeah, lots of good comments about lots of learning going on tonight. So yes, I think that mission accomplished.
I've learned that you really, really, really know how to cook porcini, like connoisseurs eye for that. So we should ask you.
Yeah, and that goes back to what I was saying, is like, what can we learn from porcini? Because like what I learned, especially from going to Europe and seeing how it was prepared, is that and when I went to how often we recommend to people, oh well, for a mushroom for the first time, I like to just saute it in butter and kind of see what it tastes like, and then you kind of get an idea for what it tastes like, and then you cook with it. Well, how they did that in Spain was every single one of those mushrooms was served with olive oil and those poached eggs. And that was how I kind of got a taste for the different mushrooms they had over there. And that was how they wanted to showcase them. But beyond that, each mushroom had extremely specific preparations that, you know, maybe went back hundreds, if not thousands of years in their origin. So it's important to try to follow in those footsteps a little bit, or build off of that. You know, you can't, it's hard to experiment or create something new before you have really sort of tried what's already been done and know the mushroom very well.
Before we lose any more people, I just want to put a plug in really quick. Arne might have said this at the beginning, but Arne runs Northern Mushroom Tours out of Bayfield, Wisconsin. And obviously we've seen him just kind of scratch the surface of his knowledge just about one clade of mushrooms tonight, but he is, you know, his knowledge is so, you know, depth and breadth, you know, as far as a lot of different types of mushrooms and how to prepare them and everything too. So if you ever want a one-on-one time with Arne, or even, you know, get a group of people together just for fun, to go up and rent him out for a day, and he will take you on a trip, and it will be super, super fun. And Bayfield is so beautiful. So feel free to look him up and follow his business on Instagram. I know it's Northern Mushroom Tours. Are you on Facebook as well, Arne, or no?
I am, yeah, and I do also have a personal Instagram that I just started as well to share some photos and stuff. So thank you so much, Melissa. I appreciate that.
I'll put
Yeah,
both
Northern
of
Mushroom
them in
Tours.
chat.
I have a website as well. You can book through there, or feel free to email me about the talk, or, you know, questions about mushrooms you have. I'm happy to help anyone who has any questions for me. You people were talking a little bit about where in Wisconsin can they find different types of porcini. That's a great question I didn't really cover. Up here, you know, in the north, really anywhere north of the Cable area, or Cable, or north of their Hayward area, is obviously going to be better for the diversity, or the number of different types of porcini clade mushrooms you can find, just because diversity of all mushrooms is higher up here. But there are certainly species that are specific to different areas in southern Wisconsin, and finding out which species is most prevalent in your area, and targeting that, and learning its season, which trees it grows with. That's really what your goal should be. And some tools to help you do that. One of the main tools to help you do that is like iNaturalist, exploring you know, different species in your area. Some of the species we talked about, look if Boletus subcereulescens grows near you, or edulis, or, you know, which one is growing in your area. How many sightings are, you know, in your area? Is maybe 10 miles east, there's way more sightings than where you're at. So, you know, go east. So looking for that concentration of different sightings, looking in the notes of the observations, and seeing what they were growing with. Use these hints. Go on Facebook and see, you know, go to the, you know, the various mushroom pages, and see who's posting what, who's posting, you know, I got a bunch of these, and look in the background of their photo and see what trees are in the background of their photo. Are they sitting in pine trees? All these little clues you should be using to really piece together the mystery of where they're growing in your area. And when you finally do, it's so satisfying. I'll tell you, this year, you know, I've been picking in one spot out in the barrens, the pine barrens in our area, for years. Been picking chanterelles there, and I've never gone out there to look for porcini, because I never thought to. And this year I happened to go out there because I saw a lot of the subcereulescens growing with red pines in just other areas that I had been in, and I knew there's tons of red pines out there, so I thought I might as well check it out. Sure enough, there's tons of them out there. So then I'm going, okay, well, where can I go that's like this environment? So I start looking at the satellite imagery. Okay, here's what this red pine plantation looks like from the air. There's lots of red pine plantations around it, but some of them are, you know, the rows look wider spaced, or the trees look bigger in the satellite imagery. So that's probably different. So look for that exact same plot of land as close as you can, or one that looks similar, as close as you can to where you are, and then you're apt to find more. Are they growing on a slope and not on flat ground right now? You know, then look for a sloped area. There's all these little clues that you might want to be queuing in on. What in my case this year, the subsidiary lessons was growing in these red pine plantations with almost no undergrowth. So you wanted to go to the ones that had no little saplings growing in between the big red pines, no ferns or anything. It was just a beautiful open plantation, and that made it great for picking because there's no dirt, no stuff to climb through. But it was extremely satisfying when I did find another spot and suddenly realized I was standing in 500 acres of thousands of pounds of porcini. So it pays off. All right. I think I don't see any more in the chat that I didn't get, but if anyone has any questions that I didn't get to, feel free to get a hold of me. I'd be happy to help you with them. Other than that, I think that's it.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Arnie. And yeah, Walker did mention that we have the November lecture coming up too. So that's an in-person lecture in Waukesha at the Steam and Cup. There's a limited number of slots. We emailed about that. So if people are interested, there still are a few slots left. Feel free to sign up to come see Allison Pulio. But if you're really not serious about coming, please don't take a spot, because since spots are so limited, we only want people to take spots if they're actually going to use them, instead of like taking a spot and then having an empty seat when it could be filled by someone who actually wants to be there. So just be thoughtful about that. But we are very excited to have her and anyone who really wants to come see her in that room in November. So that's probably our last notification for the day. And anyone else have anything to add or ask?
No, I think that's it. If anyone, I know I was cutting out a little bit, so if anyone couldn't hear something I said and they got a question about that, definitely send me a question. I'm happy to answer, so don't be shy.
And they can send that to you on Facebook or maybe an email or.
Yep, email. On my website.
Ironically, you're cutting out right now a little bit.
Facebook, Instagram. My website has my business email. Really, any way to get a hold of me. There's lots.
Okay, cool. And Melissa, what is the lecture subject for Allison Puglia? I think you'd summarize it better for me. Glenn was asking in the chat.
It's interesting because the thing that she said, her bio that she sent, had like something that was kind of nebulous. It was like about mushrooms and the connectedness of nature and that kind of thing. So I don't really know. I think we're kind of walking in blind to some extent. But I mean, Britt Bunyard picked her, and she's from Australia. So she's coming from a long way away. And anyone who Britt, thinks is worth pulling into a room, I would say is someone that we should probably pay attention to.
Yeah. She's on the book tour, right?
So
yes, she is.
Her work is incredibly extensive. And I've looked a little into her, and I think she's going to be a great guest that you don't want to miss. I'm going to head out, but thank you all for coming to my talk. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
I'm leaving too. Thanks,
night,
Arnie, and thanks everyone else for coming.
Thanks, Arnie.
Yep, no problem.
Yeah, champion lecture. Okay, so I'm going to close the meeting really soon. So if you had anything to grab out of the chat, please do so. Like links or anything you wanted to copy. This is the last call on that. I'm trying to give a fair amount of time. Okay, well, thank you so much to everybody. Glad to see you all. Good night.